From the television studios of the Jack J. Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston, my name is John David Powell, and this is the Discovery section of Graffiti, the electronic newsletter of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Nigeria and oil is the topic of this month's discussion with our guest, Karen Klieman, Associate Professor of History and the author of Before the Curse, Petroleum, Politics, and Transnational Oil Companies in the Gulf of Guinea, Africa, 1960 to 1980. The book provides a detailed history of relations between transnational companies, their home governments, and their historical connections to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, and Angola during the first 2 decades of African independence. And we're glad you could join us today. Lots of things are happening over there. Nigeria used to be the #1 oil producing country in Africa. It has now dropped down to #2 behind Angola, mostly because of the violence over there. So what is going on and what's behind it? And we should point out that this is a book in progress.
Yes. Yeah, in process. There's a lot of ways to look at what's behind it. I'll start with the shorter history, and if you're interested, we can go into a deeper history.
Okay.
But in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been pretty much a low-grade war in the Niger Delta region, where local peoples have felt their argument is they've been occupied by oil companies and the government has taken the revenues to their detriment, and that they're not getting a fair share of the revenues. So protests started out in the 80s with women and youth. In the 90s, they moved into more organized, but they were nonviolent. And the government reaction has been throughout all these years, basically violent repression, and it hasn't made the situation any better. But Nigeria's at a crisis point now where they've got, at this point over the past 5 years, 30 to 40% of their production has stalled out, so they're 30 to 40% below capacity. It's starting to affect their revenues, it's starting to affect the government. And so the most recent episode is that the government is offering an amnesty. There's estimated 8,000 to 10,000 militants in the region. They're asking them to turn in their arms. But the complaint is with the locals and the militants themselves is that the amnesty doesn't have any kind of post-amnesty program. They're asking them to turn in their arms, and they'll pay them a $13 a day stipend. But the arms themselves are worth millions of naira, and so it's not working very well at present.
Where do they get these arms?
They buy them on the international market, and they're oftentimes much more sophisticated. They've got AK-47s and gunboats and
more
GMPs.
Sophisticated than the Nigerian government.
Yes, more sophisticated than the Nigerian government. So, and there's a lot of collusion of local governors. The politicians are involved in it. So, you know, it's a very, really complicated and somewhat messy situation in Nigeria as far as the corruption. A way that people have tried to make money down there because they don't get access to the revenues is bunkering, which is tapping into pipelines, and it's very dangerous. A lot of people die because they explode, but then they sell it on the illegal market. The oil is sold illegally internationally, and so it's really a crisis point. Not only that, in the north now, because the government, you know, Nigeria suffers what's called the oil curse. It's the archetypical case of it, and so 95% of the state's exports are oil. 80% of the state's revenues come from oil. The rest, what happens with the oil curse is that the rest of your sectors, the agriculture and the manufacturing, everything dies out. So oil is the only way to make a living there. So you either need to be in the oil business or in the government, and anybody who's not suffers. And in Nigeria, what has happened is 4/5 of the population live under $2 a day, and 80% of the wealth goes to 1% of the population, and 70% of that wealth is held abroad. So we have very, very rich people and very, very poor people, and the poor people are rising up. So Nigeria's in a crisis not only because of the Delta insurgency, which has been going on really pretty heavily for the last 5 to 10 years, but in the north now we've got Muslim youth who are angry about their situation and are rising up with kind of political Islam and criticizing the government themselves. So Nigeria's getting it from both ends, and the new government, which was put in place 2 years ago, is not really a legitimate government, and I think the people are fed up. They're starting to rise up, and Nigeria's in trouble, and that's why their production has gone down.
Let's talk about the Muslim connection. The news we get now in the last few weeks has been, on occasion, Muslim terrorists, Muslim extremists attacking oil refineries or oil production. But apparently that's something new. It would be unfair to characterize this as Islamic driven.
Definitely. In the South, it's not Islamic driven at all. There's only one leader who converted to Islam, and he's not running on that kind of agenda at all. The Muslims are in the North. Historically, there's been a problem in Nigeria. It's a nation that really shouldn't exist. It's got three completely different types of societies that were put together by the British. The North were living in sultanates and emirates for hundreds of years, thousands of years really. And in the Southeast, we have what we call village democracies, where there was never really any centralized government. And in the West, we had kingdoms, which were very hierarchical, that were non-Muslim. So the South is non-Muslim, and that's where the oil is all drilled, and the North is Muslim. But historically in Nigeria, the Northerners, what they call the House of Fulani, have run the government and profited from the oil, and so the Southerners are angry about that because they've been in the government. The House of Fulani have been in charge of the government and taken advantage of the oil revenues. But here's what's happening at this point. Even in the North now, they didn't spread the wealth among their people, so they're having these kind of the youth going into an insurrection in the North with Islamic ideologies, with political Islam. And in the South, you've got people revolting because of not Islamic. It's not Islamic at all in the South. What it is they want equity, they want democracy. The area itself has been very underdeveloped since 1967. Well, there was a war from 67 to 69. And really, if you look at it historically, the region was left underdeveloped because that war was called the Nigerian Civil War, or the Biafran War, was essentially around the issue. The oil was starting to come in, and it was, how are we going to divide up these revenues? And there's a lot of ethnic problems and a lot of killing around that at that time. So we combine kind of very intense ethnic rivalries in Nigeria with a very intense competition over resources. Those three regions have been fighting and have a lot of anxiety and tension since the beginning of the Nigerian Federation in the 60s over how we're going to divide the revenues, how much should the Northerners get when their region doesn't actually supply any of the oil, and that type of thing.
So is this confined as an internal problem, or do we see outside agitators, outside influences, other nations?
Well, it is a Nigerian problem and they need to deal with it. But the problem in the South was that because the governments were so invested in getting those oil revenues, they allowed oil companies, international oil companies, to work with impunity. And that means that they never required them to do any kind of, they didn't watch the environment. They really ruined the environment in those regions. So down in the South, in the Niger Delta, even if you just wanted to farm and live as your 19th century ancestors did, you can't do that anymore. The land is ruined. There's been gas flaring for 50 years there. So there's all sorts of acid rain, the dredging, the building of the pipelines. And, in the past 15 years or so, really since the 90s, Nigeria's been able to kind of deal with this problem by moving most of the oil production offshore. And so they're still getting the revenues. But at this point, they're at a crisis where the people onshore, even Shell, which was focused mostly onshore, kind of cut out doing so much onshore and is focusing offshore too. That's the trend in Africa. But with the poverty and the despair, it's just utter despair among the population in Nigeria. And Nigerians are very sophisticated. They're very, very well educated, the majority. And there's just going to be a certain point where things are going to have to change. The Nigerian government is going to have to change. And the Western oil companies have tried to do corporate social responsibility, but that's not something that they enjoy doing, and they don't feel that they should have to be taking care of government. But the fact is, the Nigerian government would not exist and the revenues would not exist without the oil companies operating with them. And so it's been kind of a symbiotic relationship between the federal government and the oil companies for 50 years. But the Southerners feel it's a parasitic relationship.
Karen Klieman, you've given us a little bit more background on this situation that's going to be in the news for quite a while.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us.
Yeah,
and
thank you so
thanks
much.
for explaining it. And thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next month.